Question period. I recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Now that story time is over, Saskatchewan people today are struggling with inflation, and they're struggling with the rising cost of living. Now, what's driving that inflation, Mr. Speaker? Higher gas prices. From CTV, and I quote, "Economists say that inflation likely flared up again in February amid higher gasoline prices." End the quote. Mr. Speaker, luckily, there is a solve for rising gas prices, lowering gas prices. Why won't this tired and out-of-touch government finally do just that and offer Saskatchewan people some relief at the pumps?
Recognize the Premier.
Without a doubt, Mr. Speaker, identified by the Parliamentary Budget Officer, one of the most significant causes of inflation in across Canada and in Saskatchewan, Mr. Speaker. It's been the constant and annual increase of the carbon tax on our gasoline, on our groceries, on virtually everything that we consume, Mr. Speaker. Point being said, the CPI dropped almost a full point here in Saskatchewan, Mr. Speaker, again identified, I believe, by the Parliament, I think it was Statistics Canada this time, Mr. Speaker, said that the almost point drop in the CPI, or the inflationary measure in Saskatchewan, was due to this government removing the carbon tax from home heating fuel, Mr. Speaker. Can you imagine the drop if we removed the entire 17 cents off of a litre of fuel in the province, Mr. Speaker? The unnecessary carbon tax imposed by the federal government, supported by the NDP, Mr. Speaker, across this nation. Mr. Speaker, when it comes to inflationary issues, inflationary challenges that Saskatchewan families are facing, I've stood on the floor of this Assembly, the Deputy Premier stood on the floor of this Assembly and in the Rotunda, Mr. Speaker, and spoke to the over $2 billion in inflationary measures, in affordability measures, Mr. Speaker, that are present in each and every budget, taking 112,000 people off the provincial tax rolls, Mr. Speaker, allowing us to pay lower taxes, Mr. Speaker, as a whole than we ever did under the New Democratic Party when they had the honour to govern this province, Mr. Speaker. And we're going to continue to do more in months into the future, Mr. Speaker. In fact, you may even see some more initiatives in just a couple of days when the provincial budget is delivered.
Recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, why take the opportunity to do what you can do today when you can point fingers and distract and divide, Mr. Speaker? This is a Premier that is failing today to deliver on the cost of living, and he has completely failed, Mr. Speaker, when it comes to our public finances. Let's look at that Premier's record, Mr. Speaker. When he took over from Brad Wall, Saskatchewan had $17.6 billion in debt. At mid-year, we had over $31 billion, Mr. Speaker. That's nearly double. And there's more debt to come, undoubtedly, on Wednesday. How does the Premier justify doubling Saskatchewan's debt during his short time in office?
Recognize the Premier.
Let's look at Saskatchewan's record, Mr. Speaker, when compared with the rest of Canada when it comes to the capital investments that are being made in this province. Second in the nation today, Mr. Speaker, up 25%, projected to go up another 14% this next year, Mr. Speaker, which will put us first across the nation. Let's look at our record when it comes to exports. Announced the other day, exports are up to the country of India, $20 billion in ag exports, Mr. Speaker, achieving our growth plan target. Part of our $50 billion in exports, which is a record number from the province of Saskatchewan, exporting $50 billion of product to over 150 countries around the world, Mr. Speaker. Let's look at the nearly 20,000 jobs that were brought to light by the communities and businesses operating in those communities right across the province just this past year. Mr. Speaker, in a couple of days, we're going to see the provincial budget delivered by this Deputy Premier, Mr. Speaker. You're going to see what the strength of an economy can do when it comes to investments in our classrooms, investments in care, and investments in our communities, Mr. Speaker, most certainly providing for a brighter future for Saskatchewan residents.
Recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
The bluster as usual, Mr. Speaker, but this Premier is on track to double Saskatchewan's debt. That is his record. He's added $14 billion to the debt since he became Premier. Mr. Speaker, they won't want to hear that, but that is more than Grant Devine. Mr. Speaker, will remember Grant Devine as the Conservative Premier who nearly bankrupted this province. But this Premier, Mr. Speaker, this Premier is in a league of his own. How does the Premier feel about the fact that he's added more debt to Saskatchewan people than Grant Devine?
Recognize the Premier.
Speaker, the measure that provinces use and the federal government uses, Mr. Speaker, the federal NDP Liberal coalition government uses, is net debt to GDP. Where we are in this province, Mr. Speaker, is second lowest in the nation when it comes to our net debt to GDP, Mr. Speaker. This is what a strong and growing economy is able to bring the people of Saskatchewan, Mr. Speaker, is the second lowest net debt to GDP in the nation of Canada. All the while, Mr. Speaker, unlike a time in this province when there was 176 schools closed, over 400 teachers laid off across the province. We are building schools, Mr. Speaker, and I dare say you might see a few more in just 2 days when the Deputy Premier rises to her feet, Mr. Speaker. Unlike the members opposite that were firing nurses, firing doctors, and closed 52 hospitals in this province, Mr. Speaker, we are building hospitals, replacing hospitals. Most notably, I would say the Saskatchewan Hospital in North Battleford and the Jim Pattison Children's Hospital in the city of Saskatoon, Mr. Speaker. We are providing, as they would have learned just last week, Mr. Speaker, record funding to municipalities, Mr. Speaker, and we are building highways as opposed to encouraging communities to go out in a community building project and fix their own highways, Mr. Speaker, which is the way it was under the NDP. Mr. Speaker, what you are going to see through the strength of a growing economy in this province is in 2 days is a provincial budget delivered by this Deputy Premier, which is going to show what that can do in the way of investing in our classrooms, and what that can do in the way of investing in care in this province, Mr. Speaker, and what that can do in the way of investing in our Saskatchewan communities.
Recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
I'll give him this, Mr. Speaker. It's some bold for him to try to stand up there and brag about his record on education and so much more. But, Mr. Speaker, as a former Premier used to say, the best predictor of future behaviour is past behaviour. So what does this Premier's record have us to believe will be contained in the budget on Wednesday? We can expect record levels of debt and a projected surplus, Mr. Speaker, that will sometime in the future surely turn into a deficit. Because, Mr. Speaker, that's what we saw just last year from that government. $1 billion surplus that turned into a $250 million deficit. And with hundreds of millions of dollars in extra spending, Mr. Speaker, it's fair to say that that government blew their budget by $2 billion. Mr. Speaker, when will that government, that Premier, accept any responsibility for his incompetent management of our public finances?
Recognize the Premier.
Day after day, we see this alternate reality standing up, Mr. Speaker, before us in the opposition members, Mr. Speaker, where they member after member ask for us to remove this tax, remove that tax, remove that tax, invest more here, spend more there, Mr. Speaker, and all the while they're going to say that why isn't the budget balanced in the province, Mr. Speaker? Mr. Speaker. A wise member that served as a Minister of Agriculture on this side, Mr. Speaker, he was our first Minister of Agriculture in 2007, once said, when you're in opposition, you can say whatever you want because nobody's going to take you to account. Mr. Speaker, when you're in government, you have to make serious decisions on behalf of the people that we represent across this province, Mr. Speaker, serious decisions that involve
$3 billion.
Is it a competition over there? Who can talk the loudest?
creating an environment, Mr. Speaker, where our economy can grow and prosper, so that we can take the proceeds of that strong economy, Mr. Speaker, and invest them in our classrooms, invest them in care, and invest them, Mr. Speaker, in our communities from corner to corner to corner to corner in the province of Saskatchewan.
Recognize the member from Regina Rosebar.
Mr. Speaker, that Premier has added more debt than any Premier in Saskatchewan's history. And in his response, he chose to remind us that he also brought about the biggest tax hike in Saskatchewan's history, Mr. Speaker. This tired and out-of-touch government has wasted public dollars hand over fist. From the GTH to the bypass to sweetheart deals with donors and insiders, that's that Premier's record. How does that Premier defend his legacy of debt, including the fact he's added more debt than Grant Devine?
Recognize the Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, I'm very curious how the members opposite would even begin to fund their promises, because they have no plan. They criticize, but they have no plan. In order to forego the fuel tax, what tax would they increase to backfill it? Because that tax goes towards repairing the roads. Would we have to go back to repairing our own roads because they forego that revenue? That money that is borrowed is building hospitals, Mr. Speaker, something that never happened under the NDP. The NDP closed hospitals, laid off nurses and doctors. Mr. Speaker, that borrowing is going towards building schools, Mr. Speaker, a record number of schools, Mr. Speaker. Under the NDP, schools were closed, teachers and support staff were laid off. Mr. Speaker, it does not make any sense for that member opposite to stand when their record was so abysmal. The only thing they decreased when they were in government was the population of Saskatchewan.
Recognize the member from Regina-Rosemont.
Mr. Speaker, as we pointed out today, the premiers of the NDP in the past, they decreased debt, Mr. Speaker, unlike that premier and this other Sask Party premier, and of course Grant Devine. We're talking about that Sask Party government's record, and the worst part, for all that big spending, they sure don't have the results to show for it. We have the longest waits for hip and knee replacements in Canada. Women have to go to Calgary to a Sask Party donor to get a mammogram at 10 times the cost. Cash-strapped families are left behind with no relief at the pumps. Education is at a breaking point. Yet this tired and out-of-touch government has added more debt than any other Saskatchewan premier. And when it comes to delivering for people, they're dead last on results. How does the Sask Party and that premier defend this indefensible record?
Recognize the Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, it is easy to defend when you look at the new schools across our province. It's easy to defend when you look at the new hospitals we've built. It's easy to defend when you look at the new long-term care homes that we've built. It's easy to defend when you see that highways are actually being repaired now instead of going to pothole abysmal state of affairs that they were under the NDP. Right. Mr. Speaker, what hospital would they not have built? What school would they not have built? They need to now stand up and say, we wouldn't have spent that money, Mr. Speaker. We don't think that school is necessary. We wouldn't have spent that money because we don't think a hospital is necessary. We don't think we'd spend the money. We have a growing province. We need more people to be hooked up to power and energy, but we wouldn't hook them up. We just leave them out in the cold, Mr. Speaker, because we're not going to allow our crowns to borrow money for infrastructure.
Recognize the member from Regina-Rosemont.
Mr. Speaker, the list of waste and mismanagement and scandal from that government is long. They've wasted money hand over fist, day in, day out, from sunrise to sunset. Mr. Speaker, Saskatchewan people know it. They talk a big game about balancing the budget. Of course, they couldn't balance the budget, so instead they had to scrap their balanced budget legislation. And of course, this premier has balanced only one budget, and that one was a bit of a fluke year. The last budget has gone from $1 billion surplus to $1 billion deficit, a $2 billion miss on the budget, Mr. Speaker. Saskatchewan people deserve better performance, and they deserve the straight goods, Mr. Speaker. Why won't the finance minister come clean and release the third quarter financial report instead of burying the deficit and their wild mismanagement in the back pages of the budget on Wednesday?
Recognize the Minister of Finance.
Two more sleeps, Mr. Speaker, and he will see the budget and he will see the third quarter and he will have all of his curiosity answered. Quite frankly, unlike the people of Saskatchewan who will have to wait patiently for a long, long time to ever figure out what the plan is of the NDP, what they would close or what they would increase in taxation in order to cover the cost of their promises. They can say a lot, Mr. Speaker, but they have yet to be forthright and let the public know how they would pay for their plan. How would they pay for their promises? How would they pay for their $3 billion worth of items and extra spending that they said they would do without one single idea of what they would do to pay for it? Because someone's got to pay for it or else they got to borrow it. It's one or the other. So what is the NDP plan? Because that's what's buried and that's what the public doesn't know.
Recognize the member from Saskatchewan Eastview.
Hear, hear.
Mr. Speaker, you'd think that with the record debt under this Premier's watch that we'd be leading the nation when it comes to education funding, but that's not the case. Instead, we've seen per-student funding under this tired and out-of-touch government fall from first in Canada to one of the last. It's why teachers are taking job action. It's why teachers will be here on Wednesday instead of in the classroom. Why won't the Minister of Education do his job and finally get a deal that addresses class size and complexity?
Hear, hear.
Recognize the Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to let the member know that we do lead the nation in education funding. When it comes to per capita funding into K-12 education, Mr. Speaker, Saskatchewan has led the country among all provinces for multiple years, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, why is that, Mr. Speaker? We have increased school operating funding, Mr. Speaker, every year. We've got another school operating funding increase coming on Wednesday, Mr. Speaker. But we've also invested significantly into capital around the province. $2.4 billion over the last 15 years into school capital, Mr. Speaker. 60 new schools, 30 major renovations, Mr. Speaker. I'm looking forward to Wednesday to talking about more capital investment coming to schools in Saskatchewan.
Recognize the member from Saskatchewan Eastview.
Mr. Speaker, this impasse continues only because of this tired and out-of-touch government's refusal to bargain in good faith. Hoopla cancelled, Mr. Speaker. That's on them. And the students who are here today need this government to change their course and find a path through.
Hear, hear.
Teachers and students deserve so much better than the smarm offensive that this minister brings to his job each and every day. Mr. Speaker, the only path out of this is a deal that addresses class size and complexity. If the minister won't negotiate that with teachers, why won't he send just those issues to an independent arbitrator to decide? If he does that, sanctions will end today.
Hear, hear.
Recognize the Minister of Education.
Mr. Speaker, as a former player, a former referee, a former coach myself, I understand well the hard work that has gone in across the province by teachers, by coaches, by players, all across the province, Mr. Speaker. But you know, Mr. Speaker, you know what's unfortunate is now that the Saskatchewan Teachers Federation leadership have decided to target the hard work of those coaches and athletes around the province by threatening to cancel Hoopla this year, Mr. Speaker. That is incredibly disappointing. Mr. Speaker, I don't think it's acceptable for the union leadership to cancel something that students have spent thousands of hours on when they've only been at the bargaining table for 30 minutes in the last 5 months, Mr. Speaker. Actions speak louder than words, Mr. Speaker. Government has brought a renewed mandate to the table, tried to bring forward solutions, Mr. Speaker. It's time for the STF leadership to stop looking for excuses and get back to the bargaining table.
Recognize the member from Saskatchewan Eastview.
Mr. Speaker, if that minister worked half as hard as those athletes up there, we would have a deal already. Mr. Speaker, we're at an impasse. Teachers won't budge on their demands for a deal that addresses class size and complexity, and the minister won't budge from his demands and his refusal to negotiate. There's no path forward under the SAS party status quo. It's time for that minister to get out of the way, for an independent arbitrator to come up with a solution that works for both sides. Does the minister realize that he is the problem? Why would he agree to settle this dispute with teachers through binding arbitration so that sanctions can end today?
Recognize the Minister of Education.
Mr. Speaker, when I was a coach, I made it clear to my team that I expected them to play for a full 40 minutes. You can't win the game unless you play for a full 40 minutes. Right. But, Mr. Speaker, instead, what we've seen from the union leadership, they haven't even played a full game, Mr. Speaker. They've been at the bargaining table for 30 minutes over 5 months, Mr. Speaker. And now the union leadership is choosing to target the hard work of students and coaches all across the province by threatening to cancel hoopla, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, let me just remind the members opposite about the government's actions over the last 5 months. While the STF leadership have not been coming to the table, Mr. Speaker, we've come forward with annualization of pilot projects and class size and composition funding, Mr. Speaker, enhancements to classroom safety, Mr. Speaker. Government has come forward with a renewed mandate on, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, when it comes to salary, we are not going to do 23.4% over 4 years, Mr. Speaker, but we have offered a healthy salary increase to the teachers who do important work in our province, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, these are the actions that government has done. It is time for the union leadership to come back to the table.
Recognize the member from Regina Wall Central.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This tired and out-of-touch government is allergic to transparency, Mr. Speaker. They're keeping the size of the deficit under wraps, and they're keeping the Medical Services Branch statistical report under wraps, too. This report shows how many doctors and specialists are working in Saskatchewan. Now, normally, this gets posted online, but the Sask Party is refusing to release it until after the session is over. How does the Minister of Health justify this total disregard for basic transparency?
Recognize the Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We have the Ministry of Health Medical Services Branch Annual Statistical Report for 2022-2023 available today, which we'll table here in the Assembly today. Mr. Speaker, what the report highlights, Mr. Speaker, is that the number of licensed physicians in Saskatchewan over the past 5 years, the number of licensed physicians has grown in the province of Saskatchewan, Mr. Speaker. In the number of active physicians, Mr. Speaker, there's been an increase over the past 5 years in the number of active physicians practicing in Saskatchewan. In the area of active rural general practitioners, Mr. Speaker, more active rural GPs in rural Saskatchewan, Mr. Speaker. In the area of active specialists, that has grown to 926, Mr. Speaker. Also an increase over the past 5 years in the number of specialists here in our great province, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize a member from the Regina Stone Centre.
Mr. Speaker, when the Sask Party refused to release the third quarter financial report, we FOI'd it. When the Sask Party refused to release the Medical Services Branch, we FOI'd it. Good to see the Minister of Health change his position here today on that. Finally. The Sask Party denied both requests by relying on a loophole that says government doesn't need to release a record if it's being published within 90 days. The Independent Information and Privacy Commissioner recommended back in 2016 that this loophole be closed and that it be decreased to 20 days. If that had happened, the public would have the records. Why won't the Minister of Justice close the loophole and fix our broken Freedom of Information system? Hear, hear.
Recognize the Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in 22-23, government institutions processed 1,534 access requests for general information, and where records existed, which is in 872 cases, access was granted in full or in part 96% of the time, Mr. Speaker. Saskatchewan has a short wait time, relatively speaking, for FOI requests, an average of 20 days. It maintains the lowest percentage of FOI requests that require over 30 days to complete at 16%. Applications granted, partially or in full, increased to 832 in 22-23 as stated, compared to 268 in 2018-19, Mr. Speaker. That is a 210% increase.
Hear, hear, hear. Recognize a member from Saskatoon Centre.
Mr. Speaker, hundreds of people have died from overdose in Saskatchewan. Last year, we set a new record with 476 deaths. The crisis has claimed the lives of almost 2,000 people since 2018, and a disproportionate number of the people we are losing are First Nation and Métis people. When will the Sask Party stop the harm and come up with an evidence-based plan to address overdoses and save lives?
Recognize the Minister of Mental Health and Addictions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for the question. Mr. Speaker, as I've said many times in this House, our government has a plan, and that plan is focused on treatment and recovery so that we can help individuals who are battling addiction overcome their addiction and live healthy lives in recovery. To that end, Mr. Speaker, we have announced more than 183 new addiction treatment spaces across Saskatchewan. Mr. Speaker, we have 15 new spaces at the Thorpe Recovery Centre in Lloydminster. We have 60 new spaces coming in Lumsden, Mr. Speaker. 14 new spaces at the former Drumming Hill facility in North Battleford, now operating as Poundmakers Lodge. Mr. Speaker, we have 32 spaces through Possibilities Recovery Centre in Saskatoon, 26 addictions treatment spaces at St. Joseph's Addiction Recovery Centre in Estevan, Mr. Speaker. And we have 36 virtual spaces offered by EHN across the province, Mr. Speaker, so that every individual in this province has easy access to addictions treatment spaces. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.